Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Nocturnity as we officially begin our first October Terror Fest. And to celebrate the occasion properly, tonight we have a terrifying story involving a Midwestern cult that is guaranteed to have you on the edge of your seat at many, many times throughout, if not the entire time. You'll be put smack dab in the middle of a satanic ritual at a few points, so get ready to feel your skin crawl. It's going to be fantastic. As always, this episode is brought to you by CardanApparel.com. Buy from them, help us out. The link is in the description. Another way to help out our young channel is to simply give this video a like, and if you can go the extra mile, a share. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join our channel officially. You won't regret it. Now, let's waste no more time and fall deep into the recesses of the realm of eternal night. Back in the 80s, I was obsessed with death metal. My walls were filled with flags and posters of Sepultura, Possessed, Bolt Thrower, Carcass, and so on. You ever heard of them? No? I'm not surprised. I'm talking real death metal, not that Motley Crue shit. We considered those types of bands posers and pussies. Back then, I lived in a small loft in Indianapolis that I shared with a buddy of mine named Bruce, and the stereo rarely stopped bleeding out thrasher guitars and wailing growls. I'm sure the neighbors just loved us. Yeah, right. They hated our guts, just like we hated all theirs. But that's besides the point. The story I'm about to tell you all really began one night when me and Bruce went to a Morbid Angel concert downtown. It was there that I'd see a girl that I was convinced would be the love of my life. Looks-wise, she was everything I'd been looking for in a woman. Pale skin, jet black hair so full of spray it was like cement, with bangs that spiked down over part of her left eye, black lipstick, dark mascara, and a wardrobe so torn up and full of spikes you would have guessed she got in a fight with a lawnmower, and won. Even I, a young man with a wall of records, wasn't as metal as her, and she knew it. No matter how hard I tried to get her attention during the show, she wouldn't give me the time of day. Once she rolled her eyes at me. That was it. That is, until towards the end of the show, when some piss-drunk asshole bashed into her, causing her to fly down to the ground and smash her drink all over the place. The crowd instantly started to fill in the gap where her body once stood, and she was about to get trampled. But because I'd been keeping my eye on her, I saw it as it happened and reached down and yanked her up, just in the nick of time, literally saving her life. She didn't thank me, though. Instead, she kicked the drunk guy in the back as hard as she could with her spiked leather boot. Though it must have hurt, he didn't fall. Instead, he turned around looking like he wanted to kill her, and took a swing at her like he was about to hit a grown man. But once again, I was watching it unfold, and had the wherewithal to block it, and wasted no time in clocking him in the jaw, full strength, my initial engraved Zippo lighter in my hand to use as a trusty fist filler. I'm pretty sure I felt his jaw crack. He ended up running away into the sea of people with his hands on his face. That was the first time I saw her smile. Not a full smile, though, just a smirk. But that was enough for me. That's when I fell head over heels for her. A few minutes after that, when the music was over, she asked me and Bruce if we wanted to go to a bar to get a drink with her and her friend. Obviously, I said yes. God knows he didn't have to twist Bruce's arm to go get a beer. We ended up getting shittered until the place shut down. I was transfixed the whole time with her. She was so cool, so dark and twisted, intimidatingly, in fact. I wanted to know everything about her. But other than the music she listened to, at that point all I knew was her name, Sophia, and that she lived about 2 hours away in a shithole town in Indiana called Odon. As we were stumbling out of the bar, she told me that her and her friend, a skinny, awkward little goth named Zeke who barely said 2 words the whole night, had to figure out a way to get home. It was like 3 a.m., and there was no way they were going to find one, so me and Bruce offered our hospitality and told them they could sleep over at our dive of a loft. They accepted, and after that night, me and Sophia were officially an item. I felt like I'd won the lottery. The next day I drove them home and made the same drive every weekend after that to go see her at her place, a rancher on the edge of town where she lived alone. This place was amazing. The walls inside were painted black, and most of her lights were red. although the majority of light in that place came from the wicks of various candles. They were everywhere. It was all so wicked. Sophia was into the same stuff I was, horror and monster flicks, death metal, and all the rest. But she was so much deeper into so many things I had no idea about. I was fascinated with her. Her book collection was full of tomes about witchcraft, the occult, spells, and black magic. She had tiny little bottles of elixirs and potions. Broken mirrors hung on her walls with little cloth dolls with pins in their bodies hanging from nooses dangling from them. It's like she lived in a Pestilence music video. She was fucking metal to the core. So much so I started to wonder if me and Bruce were the posers, not Motley Crue. I mean, we knew all the death metal bands and songs, but Sophia lived the life they were singing about. She glamorized it all to me without even trying. I'll put it this way. If I could have designed my dream girl, she would have been it. It wasn't just sexual attraction either. In a weird kind of way, I wanted to be just like her. I wanted to know about and get into all the things she was already fully submerged in. The spells, the incantations, the summonings, the rituals, all of it. She warned me when I voiced that wish that the dark arts were a dangerous thing to those who weren't built to handle them. That they weren't just a passing fancy or a toy to be played with. They were no joke. My rational faculties told me she was right, but my infatuation and romanticization with her blurred my conscious mind from paying enough attention to them. I mean, though I was honestly apprehensive inside about the prospect of diving into these things, I couldn't show her that that was the case, and genuinely wanted to know and see more. It was as if I couldn't even admit it to myself. And so, my journey began. She initiated me with a ceremony inside her house one night. In a candlelit setting, she stood in front of me wearing a black hooded cloak and read from a long, goatskin parchment as I stood in a white pentagram painted on her black dining room floor. She provided me with a piece of paper beforehand with a bunch of numbered statements written on it, and when she would ask me questions in the strange old language that she was speaking in, one I definitely didn't understand, she'd signal me to read those prepared statements, one by one in order, as answers to all of her interrogations. I'm serious when I tell you it was friggin' terrifying. The dramatic effect of the dark black room, barely lit by candles, the pentagram I was standing in, and the incense she was burning, not to mention her mastery of this dead language she was reading and executing fluently, was enough to make my skin crawl. But I continued on as if it wasn't a big deal to me. Inside, though, I was getting more and more freaked out. The only way I can describe it is that I honestly felt like we weren't alone in that place, that an invisible entity was near, that it was watching, and it was in charge. My intuition was definitely trying to send me alerts the whole time, and they got louder and louder, but I did my best to ignore them. Then, at the end of it all, she made me put my hand out and sliced it pretty deep with a dull dagger. Again, I tried my best to keep my cool, but Jesus Christ almighty did it sting like a bitch. She then asked me quite seriously, officially, and in plain English, "Do you then, from this moment forward, swear allegiance to the Dark Lord Beelzebub, to guide your path, provide your way, and take sole propriety over your very soul in exchange for the life he chooses to provide in return?" This really freaked me out. Through the flickering of the ominous candles, I could see Sophia frowning with disappointment that I was hesitating. I was so unsure of what to do, though. I knew if I said no, she'd think I was a wuss, and I'd probably lose her forever. On the other hand, though I'd always thought I didn't believe in supernatural stuff like that, if I said yes, I may have been turning my soul over to Satan. "Aaron!" she barked at me to answer. So I did what I thought was the best idea and crossed my fingers on that hand that wasn't cut behind my back and said, "I do." Satisfied, Sophia then gave me that same grin I'd fallen for at the concert a couple months before. For a second it all seemed worth it. "Put out your hand," she then ordered me. Uh-oh, I thought to myself nervously. The jig was up. But it wasn't the hand I'd crossed my fingers with that she was after. It was the one she'd sliced open. She grabbed onto it and extended my arm. With my blood then dripping on her floor, She held out the parchment she had in her hands and let the blood drip on the bottom of it and said, "Let this blood be a sign of the covenant between you and our dark lord." I watched my blood hit the goat skin as if it were in slow motion, feeling this peculiar sensation inside, as if it was my soul leaving my body, wishing so badly that that wasn't the case. Afterwards, we celebrated my black sacrament in the most carnal way imaginable. It would have been the best sexual experience I'd ever encountered, had it not been for the nagging thought in my mind that I'd just crossed over into territory I may never escape from, in this life or forever after. The next weekend was the first time since I'd met her that I wanted some space from Sophia. Well, not so much from her, I guess, but from everyone in general. I wanted to clear my thoughts and get back to being a little more grounded after what I'd done the weekend before. But like a trained puppy, when she called, I came running. After another 2-hour drive, I was back at her door. However, when she answered that evening, she didn't invite me in. Instead, she came out and walked right past me towards my car. "Are we going somewhere?" I asked. "Are you hungry?" "Come on," she ordered. All I could do was shrug and obey. Then she directed me down a series of roads that eventually led us to a massive pond. I'd later learn it was called Lion Lake. Ironically enough, we parked in the lot of a Methodist church at the edge of the water. "A little late for a picnic," I joked as we got out of the car, noting that the sun was going down. "It's no picnic we're going to, Aaron," she replied, "but there will be drinks." She said it in a very mysterious tone, as if she was hinting at something sinister, which she usually was. What I was in store for, I wondered with a sense of trepidation. After a bit of walking around the edge of the lake, we ended up at some gazebos and sat at one of the tables. It was actually a beautiful view to take in, and romantically serene enough to be completely out of character for Sophia. I was right about to comment on it when I saw a few people out of the corner of my eye. Looking over, I saw Zeke, that silent little weirdo that was with her the night we met at the concert, and another guy who looked equally as troubled, both make their ways out of a shrubbery. Both were dressed in all black and wearing despondent looks on their faces. Sophia stood up as they met up with us at the gazebo. "Aaron, this is Xander, and you remember Zeke?" Zeke gave an uncomfortable nod, while Xander put his fist out to bump, a custom that wasn't used as much back then. "What's up, Xander?" I said as I took out my Zippo to light a smoke. "And good to see you again, Zeke. How are things?" That little twerp looked like he was so full of anxiety at all times that you'd swear he was constantly on the edge of freaking out and having a mental episode. He almost vibrated with awkwardness. He looked at Sophia as he answered. "All right," he quickly grunted out under his breath. "Are we ready?" Sophia asked in that way that was more like a command to get things moving. "Let's move," Xander replied. He led us a ways from the lake to an old playground that looked like it hadn't been played in since the Dark Ages. Off to the side, covered in weed, bush, and tree growth, and lit in the night by one simple yellow lamppost a distance away, was a stone facade of an old broken-down building, maybe a house at one time, covered in spray paint. My nerves started to electrify as we approached it, and the shadowy silhouettes of people started to come out from the other side of it. There were 5 or 6 of them, and as they stepped into the dim light, I could see they were all male, and they all also wore black. From a distance, I could tell the man in the middle, a large guy, very built, with a skin-bald head and a face of stone, was the Alpha. His expression was one of anger and suspicion, and he wouldn't take his eyes off of me. When our two groups met, we stopped in place, the Alpha right in front of me. Judgmentally staring me dead in the eyes, he addressed Sophia by grunting, "This him?" I looked around the group with obvious unease while she piped up, "This is Aaron. Aaron? This is Zion." It was the first time I'd ever heard any timidity in her voice. It wasn't comforting at all. I looked back at the man in front of me, who wasn't trying to hide his scrutinizing analysis in the least. "How's it going?" I asked. He didn't answer me. He didn't take his eyes off of me either. "He's been sworn in?" Yes, Sophia answered. "He took the oath last weekend and signed in blood." Jesus Christ, I thought to myself. Sophia wasn't scared of anything, and this guy was making her stutter. His evaluation continued. Everyone's did. I felt like an animal being considered for slaughter before a feast. I even thought there was a chance that was the exact case. The prolonged silence was killing me. I suddenly felt like that Zeke weirdo looked all the time. Finally, Zion spoke. Zarin. I looked around for someone to react, then figured out this guy was actually talking to me this time. I furrowed my brow in confusion. Sorry? I inquired. From now on, you'll be called Zarin. He took the smoke out of my hand and took a puff before throwing it to the ground. With that, he turned around and began walking towards the stone facade. After a couple seconds of staring at me some more, the rest of them turned around to follow. I was somewhat frozen in place, wondering what the hell had just happened there, but I didn't have time to process it before Sophia's hand made its way into mine, her scar against my week-old wound that had just started to fully scab over. She gave me that characteristic, yet rare grin and followed the group. Zion led the way through the thickets around the facade. The other side revealed a stone staircase down underground a ways to what must have once been a cellar. I could see from the glow that candles were already lit down there. Suddenly they were all putting on black cloaks, like the one Sophia had worn last weekend during our ritual. Turning to her, I saw she was holding one out to me. I took it and put it on, wondering every second what the fuck I'd gotten myself into. With all of us now adorning these cloaks, Zion led the way down the stairs into the chamber below. Each step down I took, I had to fight outwardly, quivering that much more. What was in store for me now, I wondered. When we got to the bottom, we were definitely in a cellar. It wasn't that large, but it held us all with some space. The floor was no more than dirt with some weeds sprouting out among it, and the stone walls around us were graffitied with crude demonic markings in paint, and no doubt some were smeared in blood. All of the things you'd expect were painted there, things I'd seen on hundreds of death metal record sleeves, the goat's head, 666s, pentagrams, and then some symbols that I'd never seen that I'm sure were witchcraft related. There were candles burning everywhere. Most of them must have been scented with the same scent. I don't know what it was exactly, but my memory can recall it precisely, and it scares the shit out of me every time it does to this day. In the center of the cellar was a small table. It looked like a nightstand someone pulled out of a garbage heap or something. On top of it were a number of chalices, one for each of us, filled with a dark liquid I couldn't make out in the dimness of the environment. The group naturally formed a circle and locked hands around it, minus Zion, who hovered around us on the outside. I just went along with it. I noticed Zion grab a chain in both hands. At the end of it was what looked to be a human skull with something burning inside of it, but I couldn't get a good look as Sophia nudged me. Looking at her, I noticed she and everyone else had turned their heads towards the ground, so I followed suit. We stood in that position in the most eerie silence I've ever come up against, as Zion slowly paced around us like we were playing a game of duck, duck, goose in the depths of hell. Each slow step he took causing the chain in his hand to bounce with a haunting jangle. It gave me goosebumps as that sound got closer and closer to me, and then stopped altogether right behind me. What the hell is this, I thought. Why did he stop? My body tensed up as I stood there staring at the ground, expecting at any second to be attacked from behind and eaten alive by these animals. He didn't move, nor did I. The tension was close to choking me. And then he made his move. The chain jangled again as he stepped forward, and I listened as he got further and further away from me. When he was on the other side of the circle, I couldn't help but jump a little when his thunderous voice suddenly began to call out. What he was saying, I don't know. It must have been in Latin or something. But whatever it was only a verse, and when it was finished, everyone in the circle repeated it in unison. Everyone but me, that is. Okay, I thought, time to pay attention. Zion then said another verse in that god-awful, deep, monotone voice and language and finished just as he got behind me again, once again stopping on the spot. I joined in this time and said what I thought I'd heard. He didn't say a word for what seemed like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds. Shit, I thought. I did it wrong. Again, I nearly leapt out of my cloak as his voice thundered out another verse as he carried on his way. It went on like this for a while. He'd speak, we'd repeat. He then said a couple words in that Latin-sounding language, and everyone holding hands in the circle bowed down to crouching position. I, of course, followed along. Zion started a new incantation in a higher, even more terrifying tone, with words and language I still couldn't even pinpoint as to what it was. He paced the circle again while doing so, and then I heard him stop. I couldn't see, but I heard noise, and felt a bit of movement in our chain of hands. He then carried on for a while, doing the same, and stopped at a different place in the circle. Again, I felt a small jolt on the chain of our hands and heard what I thought was slurping. He did this again and again. Finally, he stopped behind me, and I felt a tap between my shoulder blades. Sophia and the stranger to my other side both let go of my hands and joined their hands in front of me, Sophia kind of guiding me to stand as she was letting go, or at least that's how I interpreted it. Luckily, I was right. I stood up and slowly turned around. I was not expecting to see what I saw. Zion was down on one knee. His head was hunched down inside his arm, which lay rested on his thigh, while his other arm was stretched out towards me, holding one of the chalices in his hand. I took it in mine and nervously hoped to God it was wine or juice. Nope. It was warm, thick blood. I took the whole thing down and tried my best not to vomit. It was nearly impossible. But then I felt a surge of adrenaline almost immediately from it, as Zion stood back up and looked me dead in the eyes as he passed. I got back down and joined the circle until he'd finished feeding everyone their communion ration. Finally, I felt everyone stand up, our hands remaining locked and our heads remaining aimed towards the ground. Zion paced some more and changed his voice back to the baritone he spoke in the beginning and recited one last verse. When he finished, everyone said a word in that language and let go of each other's hands. No one said anything after that. We all walked to the stairs in silence and took off the cloaks when we got to the top of them. Sophia didn't even say a word the whole time I drove back to her house except for right here and left there. As soon as we walked in her door, she was all over me. Just like the weekend before, she really got off on this stuff. But again, I couldn't enjoy it. My mind was racing. The next day, when I was getting ready to leave, I had to wake her up because I didn't have my wallet. We searched her house and couldn't find it there, nor was it in my car. I think I might have dropped it at the lake when I took off the cloak, I suggested. Can you show me where it is again? She wasn't impressed, but she came along for the ride. In the daylight, the place wasn't half as scary, or so I thought. As soon as we got to where the facade was, my heart sunk a little. It still looked terrifying. We made our way around to the back of it, and I jumped back seeing something I'd missed the night before. In the corner of this broken-down skeleton of a manor was a dead goat with its throat slashed. It looked pretty fresh. "Relax," Sophia said as she started down the stairs to the cellar. "It's dead." "I know," I said indignantly, trying to mask how shaken I was. "I just wasn't expecting to see that." She stopped on the stairs and turned back to me. "Well, what do you think we were drinking last night? Tang?" I wanted to puke. "So we were—" "Yes," she interrupted. "They sacrificed it right before we got here. We were late." I was dumbstruck. "It's not here," Sophia said from inside the cellar. It wasn't anywhere. I'd lost it. I had to drive home with no license, and worse, I had to borrow money from Sophia for gas. I was dreading having to order a new license and everything, but luckily got a call that Wednesday from Sophia, who I now learned spelled her name with a Z, saying that she'd found it. I asked where, and she said that I'd dropped it at the lake. Zion had given it to Zeke to give to her. The thought of Zion touching my wallet was enough to give me the willies, but at least I'd have my wallet back. I told her I'd be out there Saturday. "Of course you will," she returned. "Mass is every Saturday, Zarin." To that, I was more than a little taken aback. Every Saturday, I thought to myself. You haven't gone any Saturday since we met except last Saturday, I said as casually as I could. "Zion was out of town for a couple months," Sophia answered back. "You didn't like it?" "No, I liked it," I lied. "You seem pretty nervous," she said back. "Well," I stumbled. "You didn't prepare me for any of that. I was kind of lost." She chuckled. "I wanted it to be a surprise. And don't worry, you did fine. They all love you." I doubted that. I wanted to tell her that every single one of those creeps made my skin crawl, but instead I said, I hope you're right. I liked them too. It was fun. Fun? I asked myself in my head. Right, Sophia chuckled again. Don't worry, you'll get to know all the invocations by heart soon. Repetition will do that for you. I hesitated for a second and then couldn't hold back. Look, Sophia, I began. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it every Saturday. Silence plagued the phone line. You there? I asked. Zarin, she began agitatedly. I told you when you begged me to initiate you into these mysteries that it wasn't a fucking game. It's not a pool to dip your toe in and then decide you don't like the temperature. You jump right in and you stay in. I put myself on the line to vouch for you. Don't fuck me around. She was right about that. I asked her for this, not the other way around. And I was still so infatuated with her that I'd do anything to keep her happy. You're right, I said. I'm sorry. I'm just so far away. If something ever comes up, I just don't want to disappoint you. Nothing's gonna come up, Zarin, she shot back. You took an oath. You swore to it. In blood. That means it comes first. You get it? That uncomfortable tingly feeling I got looking at the facade by the lake that night came crawling back up my spine. I get it, I said. I promise. That Saturday I was back out there at the same time. The ceremony was the same at first. A bunch of devotions in a language I didn't understand, followed by the drinking of blood, usually from a goat. But once or twice over the months that I'd partake in that terrible ceremony, we used a calf or a lamb. But goats were preferred. I didn't know where the hell they were getting them from, but I assumed they stole them. The first time I watched it happen, the sacrifice that is, I could feel something inside of me die. I almost couldn't bear to see it, and though I got somewhat accustomed to it as time went on, it was never easy. I always felt sick and guilty, as if the animal knew that I could save it and chose not to. If Satan didn't own my soul already, he was killing it a little more each time one of those animals was executed in front of me. We would all gather inside the facade just after dark, and Zion would roll up with that week's sacrifice. He'd say a few verses in Latin or whatever the hell it was, and then Zeke would cut its throat. It was the only thing I ever saw the kid do that looked like it gave him confidence. It certainly gave him pleasure. In time, I grew to hate those people for what they were. Well, everyone but Sophia. I still loved her, but as far as I was concerned, the rest of them could have gone to hell for all I cared. The problem was, they probably would have loved it. Back at home, Bruce was starting to wonder why the hell Sophia never came out our way. Telling him she didn't have a car was turning into a pretty thin excuse. Truthfully, he missed his bud. We used to hang out every weekend, and suddenly I was gone. He also noticed a big change in me, I guess. I could tell. First and foremost, I was starting to hate death metal. Every song was about rotting corpses and an undying love of Lucifer. It did nothing more for me by then but remind me of the gruesome things I was taking part in every weekend. You can imagine the shock on his face when I first asked him to turn off the Hellhammer record he had spinning at full blast. "What the hell is going on with you, man?" he demanded. "Turn off Hellhammer? Have you gone mental?" I tried to tell him I had a headache, but like I said, he could see the change in me. I wasn't all dark and depressed in a cool metal way anymore. I was clearly disturbed. How could he not see it? I was. The straw that broke the camel's back came the night I was supposed to slaughter the goat, which, by the way, is called a kid. I just couldn't do it. Zion and the rest of them looked at me like I was worthless. With the blade in his hand, he walked over to me and got right in my face. I'll say right now, I'm a big guy, and was then, but Zion was massive. And not only did his position in this little cult of his make him even more intimidating to me, but at that moment he was holding a knife, and he looked like he was about to make my blood the sacrament that night. Instead, he grabbed my wrist and shoved the handle of the knife in my palm and shouted at me to do it. I turned towards Sophia to have my back, to tell me I didn't have to if I didn't want to, but she just stared at the ground. Looking around at the rest of the faces, there was no support to be found. Though they didn't avoid eye contact, they stared right at me with all the vitriol you could imagine. That little pecker Zeke looked like he was about to ejaculate in his pants. "Now!" Zion barked at me. It Definitely kicked me into gear. Suddenly I found myself doing what I never thought I had in me to do. I'll spare you the details, because describing it is just too painful for me at this stage in my life. Yes, man has been slaughtering animals for centuries. Yes, people still do it every day. But I'm not built for that shit. As far as I was concerned, I was a murderer. I'd spilled the blood of an innocent for no good reason at all. The thing wasn't even going to be eaten. In a day or two, Zeke would come back and throw it in the lake like all the rest, with blocks tied to its hooves so it sank to the bottom. And wouldn't you know it, the sight of me killing that poor baby goat turned Sophia on even more. That night was the most depraved sexual experience I'd ever have. Once again, my mind was elsewhere. In fact, that was the beginning of the end of my feelings towards her, too. In hindsight, I know now that a real lover would have recognized the pain and turmoil I was stuck in after doing that. A real lover would have seen it through the same eyes I was seeing it all through. She was the opposite. I was suddenly starting to see her for what she was. She was sick. The writing was on the wall, I guess. It was only a matter of time now until I worked up the nerve to separate from her and all that came with her completely. But unfortunately, before that happened, things got even worse. Zeke was no longer the one in charge of the sacrifices anymore. Each of us had to take a turn every week. Thankfully, mine was first, so I wouldn't have to do it again for another couple of months. A calculation that did well to set a timeline in my mind for me to escape from this madness. Really, I had no reason to keep coming back, but life is a strange thing. No matter how terrible, we get wrapped up in these patterns that become our lives, and we stupidly stick by them for longer than we know we should. Simply put, it was hard to walk away from, even though I knew it was also toxic for me. Even if I was now starting to see Sophia as the monster she was, I still had feelings for her that were hard to just turn off all of a sudden. I mean, come on, she was still my girlfriend. Stupidly, I began to think I could save her. Even more stupid than that, I thought I could trust her. But I should have remembered what she told me. Just like I had, she had taken an oath. Not to me, to the Dark Lord, and everything came second to that oath. One Friday night, we were getting shittered at her place when she started rambling about things to come. Basically blackout drunk on absinthe, she said, "The world is an ashtray, Zarin, and we're here to set it ablaze. All these people live their lives in rose-colored glasses, completely unaware of how the universe truly functions. And that's why Zion has gathered us to open their eyes. They need to know the pain they avoid, and we're going to show it to them." I took out my Zippo and lit a smoke, rolling my eyes. She tended to say stuff like this when she was drunk, and it was getting annoying. But the next thing she said shook me to the core. "We're going to use a human next mass for the sacrifice, but shh, don't tell anyone I told you. It's supposed to be a surprise." I wasn't that drunk that night, though even if I had been, that statement still would have shaken me to the core. She passed out right then and there, and I'm sure by the next morning she'd forgotten she said anything. That night was the last mass I'd ever attend. Zion told us to be prepared for the greatest sacrifice to the Dark Lord we'd ever take part in the following Saturday, one whose innocence we'd sip like the finest wine. Sophia's drunk ass the night before was all I could think about. The looks in the eyes of those fucking savages when he said it was almost enough to make me start swinging my fists at each one of them. They were so excited. It was as if at least half of them knew damn well what he meant and couldn't wait for it to happen. Sophia was looking at Zion with a huge grin on her face, much bigger than any one she'd ever thrown my way. So much for trying to save her, I thought. She really is a monster. That was my breaking point. As I drove back to Indianapolis the next day, I told myself I was never going back. I told Bruce to tell Sophia I was busy every time she called during that week. By Saturday, she was power calling every 10 minutes. We just let it ring. I let Bruce know I was going to break up with her, but I didn't tell him why. I just said I was over her and it was time to move on. He didn't press the issue. He was probably just happy I wouldn't be out in the sticks every weekend, that he'd have his buddy back. The phone didn't stop ringing until the sun was going down. A couple hours later, when Sophia would have been home from the mass at the lake, It started up again. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I picked it up. "Where the fuck have you been?" was the first thing I heard. "Look, Sophia," I began. "It's over between us. I'm sorry, but it's how it's gotta be." "Over?" she shouted. "Over? I'll tell you when it's over, Zarin." "It's Aaron," I corrected. She gasped with rage and then hung up the phone. As soon as I did the same, it began ringing again, so I picked it up. "You can break up with me all you want, Zarin," Sophia began before I could even say hello. "But you took an oath. I vouched for you. You can't turn your back on the congregation now. I guess we're just going to have to get used to seeing each other there without being a couple anymore." "No, you don't get it," I shot back. "I didn't take an oath, okay? I played a silly little game with you, and when I pretended to swear my allegiance, I crossed my fingers behind my back. It was bullshit. I'm done with you and your little cult. You people are fucked in the head. I want nothing to do with any of you blood-drinking, sick pieces of shit." Okay, I wasn't planning on letting loose on her like that, but it did feel good to release some of that overwhelming tension I'd been bottling up for so many months, to finally say how I felt. Sophia was once again silent for a while. "Look," I began, now feeling a little guilty for insulting her so bad. "No, Aaron, you look," Sophia interrupted calmly and maniacally. "You just fucked me over so bad, you don't even know. Trust me when I say this. If I were you, I would run." The line went dead. I slowly hung up, trying my best to shrug off what she just said as an empty threat, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I was already having nightmares for the past few months, but they took an even scarier turn for the worse after that phone call. Every night I'd have a choppy sleep filled with dreams of Zion and the rest of those dirtbags tying me down and cutting me limb from limb. My mind was plagued by thoughts of them coming after me, or thoughts of them putting a hex on me with their black magic. I was in a state of paranoia I couldn't escape from. To add to that, a couple days after I'd spoken with Sophia last, reports on the news started going crazy with the story of a 7-year-old boy who'd gone missing in El Nora, a town about 8 miles east of Odon, right around the time Sophia had told me about the human sacrifice Zion had lined up. Memories of Zion hinting at drinking the most innocent blood possible spun in my psyche. I was sick over it. The more I heard about the story, which was on the news every night, the sicker I felt. The boy's name was Scotty. One minute he was playing in his front yard, the next he was gone. Police dogs had tracked his scent a ways, but lost it at Route 69. I had an overwhelming feeling that was the sacrifice Zion was talking about. I guessed him and Zeke would have been the ones to steal the poor little boy, and they probably got a real thrill out of it too. Worse news came my way a few nights later. My parents' house had caught on fire and nearly incinerated them both in their sleep. Luckily they made it out in time, but it was as close as you could get. The investigators suspected arson, but couldn't rule out electrical issues. They called the fire suspicious, but deemed it as inconclusive. One thing was for sure. Their address was the one I had on my license. The license Zion had possession of for a time after that first mass I attended. I started to think he picked my pocket one of those times he stopped behind me. Maybe that tap I felt on my back was misdirection while he lifted it. Who knows? Next came a scream from the bottom of the stairs one morning when Bruce was on his way out for work. We lived above a Chinese restaurant and had to come up a long flight of stairs from the back door of the building to get into our place, and had to take that same staircase down when we left. Bruce's shriek was so blood-curdling, I was out of bed and at the bottom of those stairs in a matter of seconds, positive I'd find him stabbed and bleeding out. Well, thankfully he wasn't harmed, but there was a lot of blood. Just outside our door was the carcass of a freshly killed and skinned hog. Bruce thought it was a dismembered human at first glance, hence the scream. Smeared on the door in the blood of the poor animal were the words, "Lying pigs see the slaughter." That confirmed it. These sons of bitches were gunning for me. They had been right outside my door. The feeling of anguish that sent through me was palpable. There were no two ways about it. I had to do something before they came back. Who knows, maybe next time they'd get past the door. So I ran to the top of the stairs and called the local police station. A short time after, 2 officers were in my loft taking my statement. I told them everything, including the suspicion I had of their involvement in the kidnapping of the boy from El Nora. Bruce sat on the couch with his jaw on the floor listening to everything I said. The police seemed to have taken it all very seriously, telling me they'd follow up and contact me in the near future. A couple days later, they returned with a story I couldn't believe. They started by telling me they weren't going to book me, which threw me off from the get-go, but informed me a complaint had been filed for battery against me. Not only had Sophia denied the allegations I'd made against her and the rest of the congregation by the lake, which of course I'd expected, but she also told the police I was physically abusing her over the past several months of our relationship. She had pretty bad bruising on the side of her face when Odon officers talked to her yesterday, one of the cops said to me accusingly, and was tending to a broken arm that hospital records show she acquired around the same time you told us the two of you had broken up. They also showed she suffered a fractured skull that night. My mind was blown. "Oh my God," I said, at a complete loss to think of anything else to say. All I could do next was repeat it. "Oh my God." "God, huh?" the other officer said. "Funny you'd mention God, because she denies any association with any cult like the one you'd mentioned, and said you were the one obsessed with Satanism, not her." "That's bullshit," I returned. The cops both raised their eyebrows and looked at all the banned posters and flags hanging around the loft, all of which had satanic imagery on them. "Well, what about the boy in Elnora?" I bleated out, cutting off their judgmental gazes. "We've passed on the information," one of the officers replied, basically brushing it off as ridiculous. "Well," I continued, "what about the cellar by Lion Lake? What about the dead pig? What about my parents' house?" One of the officers sighed with irritation and flipped back a couple pages in the notepad he had in his hand. "They found some spray paint on the walls at that place by the lake in Odon. No candles, no animal carcasses, no blood, no chalices, nothing incriminating, no signs of satanic rituals at all. The place was empty. And your parents' house fire couldn't be ruled as arson either." "Look, son," the other one said, "if she decides to press charges, you can expect us back here to put you in cuffs. And if we find out this was all an elaborate ruse to frame this girl in order to deflect from crimes you've committed against her, we're going to make sure they throw the book at you." I was floored. Here I was, the victim of stalking, attacks, and threats on mine and my family's lives from card-carrying Luciferians, and I was the one now being treated like the criminal. From the very cops I'd called in the first place. The one policeman shut his notepad while giving me a look that said, "I'm on to you," and the two of them left. I sat down stunned on the couch. "A fractured skull and a broken arm," I said out loud to the empty loft. The memory of Sophia telling me she'd vouched for me and that I'd fucked her over came creeping back into my mind like an apparition. I was sure Zion, if not all of them, attacked her for when I stopped showing up. Feeling guilty, I wanted to suddenly reach out to her. I gave her a call and she answered after a couple rings, but when she heard my voice, she told me to never call again and hung up. I didn't listen. I called back right away, and she simply lifted the receiver and hung it back up in one motion. After that, I didn't know what to do. I sat there on the couch in crippling anxiety and paranoia, lighting smoke after smoke until Bruce came home. After a long talk with him, I thankfully calmed down somewhat, because he predicted that now that the cops were involved, everything would probably calm down. He figured her threat to press charges was probably a bluff to get me to back off. As he saw it, by her formally pressing charges, it would just increase the heat on her and the rest of them, because it would guarantee further investigations and statements, plus lawyers, judges, and court dates. None of them would want any of that. I agreed, but I was wrong. When I got up for work the next morning, all of my car windows were smashed in, and another dead goat lay across my front seats. My stress level nearly crippled me at the very sight of it. That was it. I'd hit my wit's end. I called into work and decided I had to take matters into my own hands, since the cops weren't going to do a goddamn thing about it. After having a tow truck pick my car up, an episode I'm sure the tow truck driver wouldn't soon forget, I asked Bruce to take me out to Odon. I was going to confront Sophia in person. I figured if she saw me, someone she used to claim to have deep feelings for, I could talk some sense into her, get her on my side, show her that I was on hers, and we could put an end to this madness once and for all without anyone else getting hurt. Bruce, ever the loyal friend, agreed it was worth a try. So we hopped into his LeBaron and made our way out of Indianapolis. My mind was racing that whole trip down the highway as to what I was going to say when I saw her, how I'd react when we were actually face to face again, if she'd call the cops and this would turn into me marching right into a jail cell, if she'd jump into my arms and see that working together was our only hope against these people, or if the entire cult would be at her place waiting to pounce on me. Was she still associating with them? I wondered. I guess I'll find out soon. But the plan changed as we were heading down her street, after that long drive out there, when a car pulled up in front of her place. I told Bruce to pull over a ways down from her house so we could observe from a distance. Out of the front door came Sophia, bruised and banged up with a cast around her arm like the officers had said. Getting inside the car waiting, my pulse quickened as they started to move right towards us. "Duck!" I shouted as I got below the window line. Bruce followed suit, just as they passed us by. Because of this, I couldn't make out who was driving, but I was confident it was a man. "Follow them," I ordered Bruce as if I was his driving instructor. "Keep a good distance." He gave no disagreements, and we trailed them through that dead town for a good 10 minutes before they ended up stopping at a small but well-kept one-floor house in a neighborhood out there I'd never been to before. After parking in the driveway, they got out of the car and walked to the front door, where the man, who I now recognized, used a key to open it up. "So that's his house," I said as they went inside and closed the door behind them. "Who is he?" Bruce asked. "That's the ringleader," I answered as I gazed with unadulterated hate at that house. "The high priest." "Zion," Bruce concluded. I nodded. "Hard to believe she's still hanging out with that dude after what he did to her." "She's as loyal to him as an abused dog to a savage master," I explained. Even though I knew that to be true, I was still sickened with disappointment at what I was seeing. My hopes of any kind of reconciliation evaporated in an instant. Just then, they reappeared out the front door of the house, Zion carrying a large sack draped over his shoulder now. Back in the car they went. My mind was a stew of boiling fury seeing that monster again. That was the cocksucker that nearly killed my parents. My intuition was screaming it. I wanted to rush his car and beat him senseless, but I managed to keep my cool and stayed ducked down in my seat as he started up his engine and reversed out of the driveway. Rationally, I knew that even though me and Bruce together on that one piece of shit would be a landslide stomp down, that would only make things worse. We'd have to kill the guy to stop him from retaliating with vicious veracity. Besides, they were up to something here. I knew it in my gut. Something criminal, something evil. And I had a feeling whatever it was, if I could catch them in the act, I just may have been able to somehow expose them for what they were, liars and criminals, and in turn get myself off the hook from the attacks and the false allegations. We once again kept a good distance and trailed them to the west side of town, where they took a county road to a cemetery called Walnut Hill, basically in the middle of nowhere. I thought, a graveyard, this is fitting, as they parked on the side of the street in front of it, but was surprised to watch them get out of the car and walk to the opposite side of the road, Zion packing that big sack with them still, and then disappear into the thick trees there. Me and Bruce traded curious looks and just kept driving past where they'd gone in, pulling over a way up the road, but still within range to keep an eye out. We sat there for about 20 minutes wondering what the hell they could have been doing in there. From our vantage point, it looked like those trees were the edge of a sizable forest. Was it just a massive bag of trash that dirtball was illegally dumping in there? If so, why was Sophia with him? I began to actually worry about her at that point, wondering if he'd taken her in there to do some terrible things to her. But just at that moment, the two of them came back out of the trees from the same spot they'd entered, sackless now, and then got back into the car. We trailed them again, getting quite good at it by this point, and watched Zion drop Sophia back off at her home. And rather than confront her at that point, as my original plan had been, we thought it better to keep tracking Zion, and so we did. He headed right back to his house and went inside, but before he did, he looked down the road in our direction. I wasn't sure if he'd looked directly at us. We were a bit too far to really tell. I dismissed the idea anyways. After all, none of them knew what Bruce drove. Even when they were dropping off those goats at our door, they wouldn't have seen his car since he parked in the only enclosed garage space afforded to us with our rent. But either way, He went inside and shut the door behind himself. After a while, we figured he wasn't coming back out, and began to feel the disappointment of following them all day and not making any progress whatsoever. Bruce suggested we go back to Sophia's to confront her, as I'd originally pitched him in order to get him to drive me all the way down there. I had another idea, though. I say we go to see what the hell they dropped off in those woods. Bruce nodded his head in agreement and fired up the engine. Yeah, he agreed. Let's do it. We parked at the cemetery where Zion and Sophia had and went into the same opening in the trees they used as well. It was a pretty thick wood, not even a trail to be used, so we just decided to weave between trees in a straight line. After a bit, we were pretty deep in and had seen no sign of a sack or anything else for that matter. It was frustrating, pushing branches and vines out of our face and walking through spider webs deeper and deeper into these goddamn trees for seemingly no reason. Bruce had finally had enough and stopped. Okay, dude, he began. This is bullshit. There's nothing. Just then, we heard something and traded wide-eyed looks of elevated attention. Before I could ask the inevitable question of, did you hear that, it happened again. It sounded like the cry of a child, and it was close. This way, I urged and took off at a good speed in the direction it had come from. In no time at all, we came to a stop at the top of a slope in the woods. At the bottom of it sat an extremely old, dilapidated wooden shack of some sort. Again, we heard the cry. It was coming from inside it. Getting to it, we went around to the other side to find a couple of doors. I'd guess at one time it was a shed, the last remaining remnant of a farm that once stood where all these trees now lived. It was composed of two sections, one large and one quite small, each with a door to the outside, and a door in between the two rooms to get from one to the other. Inside the smaller of the two was a goat with a rope around its neck that was tied to a metal ring on the wall. My adrenaline surged. This was it. After petting the goat to give it some reassurance that everything was going to be all right, we walked into the second, larger room through the door inside. Inside it were all the typical markings on the walls, 666s, pentagrams, and all the messed up witchcraft symbology I never retained when Sophia would drunkenly babble on about it. There was also a large, freshly built altar, though shabbily done, right against the main back wall. I was both elated to have found this place and overcome with the feeling I was reliving a nightmare I had recently overcome. Bruce was in awe, turning in circles at all the symbols on the wall. Look, he said, pointing in the corner of that small room with the goat. There was the sack. We opened it up to see it was full of candles, chalices, spray cans, and on top was the ritualistic blade they used to slaughter the sacrifices, covered in generations of dried blood. It was all here. I had them now. All I had to do was anonymously contact the police and tell them the location of this place on a Saturday after sundown, and they'd catch these evil parasites in the act. So much for me being the liar then. I'd have them dead to rights. I told Bruce as much and he agreed. Outside, I could see based on the light that the sun was beginning to show signs of getting tired. Come on, I said to Bruce. Let's get out of here before we're walking back in the dark. Untying the goat from the wall, we made our ways back towards the car, both of us feeling like this trip was worth it after all. We loaded the animal into the back seat, and man did I feel good about that. A sense of redemption was beginning to sweep over my constantly guilty conscience. A ways down the road, we unloaded it over a fence onto a field full of other goats, and that feeling only increased. I felt myself smile. It almost felt foreign to me. As I did it, I remember thinking that I couldn't remember the last time I'd done it. It felt good. Though the literal sun had just set, a figurative new light of hope was dawning in me. And then, BAM! Everything went black. I woke up who knows how long later in more pain than I'd ever knew was possible, completely dazed to the point that I couldn't see straight, but I could feel a bitter chill. My mouth was stuffed with something that was being kept in there by something tied around my head. I then realized I was laying down on my side on a dirt-covered floor of wooden planks in the dark. When I finally oriented where my arms were, I found them to be tied at my sides to another pair of hands. It was then, just starting to come to my senses, that I came to realize I was tied up to another person, back to back. Everything hurt. Even my Zippo lighter in my pocket was now acting as a weapon as it dug into my thigh. My eyes finally began to focus. I was in that little shed in the woods again, and I was tied to another human. I screamed as loud as I could, but it was nothing more than a silent, muffled groan with that cloth in my mouth. The panic wouldn't let me stop, though, until I exhausted myself, which didn't take long in the state I was in. After a while, the person behind me awoke and started to move as well. I could tell by those muffled screams that it was Bruce. We did our best to get up to sitting position, trying our best to work together, but didn't have the strength. Everything was sore. I felt like I'd been hit by a car, which, as it turned out, was exactly what happened. I began to cry uncontrollably, which made breathing, which was already a chore, that much more difficult. I could hear Bruce doing the same. All we could do was lay there freezing together, the right sides of our bodies and heads in terrible pain pressed against those wooden planks. Hours later, the sun showed its face through the trees outside of the shed, and we finally started to stop shaking. At one point, we found the wherewithal to get up to sitting position. While our ankles were tied together, at least they weren't tied to each other like our wrists were, and we were able to sit back to back. Still more hours of this torture later, we heard footsteps approaching. I could feel Bruce begin to breathe deep with fear the closer they got. I can't blame him, because so did I. I was sure Zion was about to turn the corner, and God knows what would come next. But it wasn't Zion. It was Sophia. She walked in still bearing that cast, and grinned at us from just inside the doorway. "Someone let our sacrifice for the night get away," she said coyly. "Luckily, we found a couple pigs to take its place." I could hear and feel Bruce start to shout and squirm, but of course the gag only gave Sophia a chuckle at his muffled attempts. She knelt down right in front of my face and said, "You're gonna like this place, Zarin. That other room is so much bigger than the place by the lake that you told the police about. Too bad they came to my house before they went to check it out, huh? It was empty by the time they got there." I wanted to kill her. To think I thought I once knew her. This person before me was even more of a monster than I ever could have imagined. "You did us a favor, really," she continued as she straightened up and gazed into the next room. "Look, we have enough space for a nice altar here. We don't have to make sacrifices before the rituals anymore. We can do it properly now and pour the blood of our offering right into our goblets as we perform the rites." She knelt down in front of Bruce, now out of my vision. "You'll be first," she told him. "We'll taste you tonight." He started freaking out and screaming again, and Sophia laughed some more. "Good," she celebrated. "Work yourself up as much as you can, Bruce. The more adrenaline pumping through your veins, the better the effect we get when we sip on what they produce for us tonight." She then walked around to face me again. "Then, the next weekend, it'll be your turn, Zarin. We'll consume the lifeblood of one of our own, the traitor that got my arm broken and my skull fractured. God, I can't wait. You deserve it so much. All you had to do was stay loyal, and all this could have been avoided. But, well," she lifted her one good arm out in front of herself, palm up in my direction to highlight my dire situation. "See you tonight, boys." With those parting words, she walked out of the shed and her footsteps faded into the distance. That psychotic, evil bitch, I thought to myself. I could hear Bruce behind me sobbing through his gag once again. For the rest of the day, we had nothing to do but sit there in excruciating pain and wait for our catastrophic fate. We did a little bit of struggling to free ourselves throughout those hours, but it was hopeless. We came to realize the ropes around our ankles led to the same rings on the wall that the goat's rope was bound to. We were stuck. Finally, the sun began to go down. I knew now that they'd all be arriving soon, and indeed, soon after it was gone, the first arrivals joined us. It was Zeke and a few others, all of them wearing big, sinister, shit-eating grins on their faces. I could feel Bruce looking this way and that as they poked their heads in the door and window to scope us out. He began to shake when they started to pop their cloaks on. Then I saw him. Zion. He came in and knelt down in front of me and spoke in a low, emotionless voice. "You were right to come here and find me. The Dark Lord has willed it so you can pay in full for what you've done. You should feel honored." Bruce was shaking like a washing machine as Zion went into the next room. Sophia then showed up again and looked in the doorway at us, but didn't say a word. In a matter of minutes, the candles were glowing in the next room and the circle was formed. It was the first time I'd watched the ritual from afar. Notwithstanding my circumstance, it was even more terrifying to witness than take part in. Bruce was entranced. I could feel his sudden stillness as we both turned our heads to the side to witness Zion, fully cloaked, walk around the circle of his disciples with that glowing skull-tipped chain in his hands. Smoke billowed forth from it as he spoke his cryptic verses by candlelight, each one repeated by the coven. It went on and on as usual. Though I still don't know what was being said, I phonetically had every part of it burned into my brain. I recognized it as well as I recognized the Lord's Prayer in Sunday school as a child. Slowly, Bruce began to quiver. He knew his time was coming soon. As did I. Even more so. Zion finally gave his final command for that part of the ceremony, and the circle lowered to their knees. This was it, I thought. Feeding time. Zion placed his skull and chain on the altar, and slowly went around the circle tapping selections to assist him in what came next. One by one they rose to their feet and turned towards us. Soon there were 4 of them, the biggest of the group, all facing us, their eyes flickering in the candlelight, barely visible from inside their cloaks. Zion picked up the dagger and led them into where we were situated. Bruce began to frantically jostle. I felt so helpless. I could only imagine how he felt. But instead of Bruce, Zion raised the blade above me and then thrust it down. I woke up moments later with an even bigger throbbing in my head than before, and some fresh blood running down my cheek from the top of my head. I was once again laying on my side on the floor, confused and groggy, my hands now tied together behind my back. But I quickly came back to reality from the muffled yet gut-wrenching wails coming from the other room. My eyes came back into focus to see Bruce tied to the altar, each hand and foot tied to a rope fastened to each corner of it. He was literally suspended in the air, just above floor level. In the glowing of the candles, I could make out his suffering expression as he whipped his head back and forth, screaming with every ounce of strength he had left inside of him. He had lost his mind. It makes my stomach turn to even recall it. In front of him was the circle of cloaked congregates, their heads bowed to the ground. Zion paced back and forth before them, the blade still in his hand, reciting the words he always said before the sacrifice was done. I couldn't bear to look as he cut Bruce from ear to ear, so I turned my head as tears came streaming out of my eyes. But then something caught my attention. The gleam of metal in the moonlight. A nail stuck into the wall from the other side was sticking out of the wall by the windowsill. A big one! I looked over at Zion to see he was still pacing, deep in prayer, and then shimmied my way a foot or two closer to it, unnoticed. The pain from my injuries doing their best to hinder me in any way they could, I somehow fought through and positioned my back to the nail, and desperately tried to line it up with my wrists. I could hear every word Zion was saying, and with each one, I knew the sacrifice was that much closer. I kept fumbling around, but couldn't find the fucking nail. He kept chanting over there. Bruce kept wailing. The pressure was enough to choke an orca to death, but somehow I persevered until I felt the point of it catch my hand and cut it, and then moved my hand up until it caught the rope between my wrists. I knew from experience that chant was going to be over in just a few words, and Bruce's throat would become a running fountain for those chalices to catch. It was at that exact moment that I felt the rope loosen. My hands were free. Grabbing the rope around my ankles, I worked the knot until it was open and stood up. The pain was so great it felt like 1 billion volts of electricity were shocking every nerve in my legs and torso. But still I moved on. Beside me was the sack Zion had brought in the day before, now open and displaying what contents were left inside of it. I reached in and grabbed a can of paint, just as I heard the last word of the ritual spoken. I cocked my head to the right and everything then happened as if in slow motion. I watched as Zion held the blade out to Bruce's throat. Bruce couldn't help himself and began to squeal out of terror. But just before his blood was spilled, I held my lighter up and thumbed the wheel. The flame caught both Bruce and Zion's attention. I pressed the tip of the spray paint and the flame the size of a geyser shot full pressure at Zion. He had no choice but to fly backwards to avoid getting lit on fire. The parasites in the circle on the ground weren't so lucky, though. I caught them unaware and directed the same flame downwards and torched them all. One by one, they began flailing around with their cloaks on fire. I didn't stop the fervor for a second. I kept moving into the room and pressing that spray can tip down like my life depended on it, which, of course, it did. And as the burning mass chaotically filed out the door in a fit of terrified madness, screaming like they were being exorcised of demons, I had Zion pinned against the far wall, the flames hitting him directly in the face. I sprayed him until the can ran out. He succumbed to it and hit the ground screaming a blood-curdling shriek, his whole body on fire. Hearing the blade hit the ground, I reached through the flames bursting forth from his cloak to pick it up. Within seconds I had Bruce free. But there was no time to celebrate. The whole goddamn shed was in flames now, and while Zion was writhing on the ground in the worst pain of his life, his face surely nothing more than a melted mess, me and Bruce ducked into the other room and I grabbed another can as we hobbled out the door. Outside, most of the congregation was rolling around on the ground trying to put themselves out. A few of them had removed the cloaks in time and attempted to come at us, but I already had the fresh can working like a torch to keep them at bay. Soon sirens began to howl in the distance, and everyone scattered. Zion never came out of the shed, and before we were too far a distance away ourselves, we could hear his cries of suffering had ended. He was nothing more than a smoldering corpse by the time the firefighters arrived. By then, Bruce and I were far enough away to have safely escaped, using every ounce of strength we could muster to keep moving through those trees. We must have gone for miles, until eventually we reached a farm and collapsed in the field. I woke up next in a hospital bed in the ICU. After my extensive injuries were explained to me, some I'll never fully heal from, all else would slowly be relayed to me as well. As it turned out, the police who had shown up with the fire engines caught several of the cult members on their ways out of the woods, and those brave little Dark Lord worshippers couldn't wait to flip on each other in order to try to lessen their sentences. In the end, my inadvertent savior was that little weasel Zeke, who tried to save himself by coming clean about everything and blaming Zion for forcing him to take part. He detailed both to the police and the judge how he had been sent to torch my parents' house, how he had been made to drive out to Indianapolis to drop off the dead animals at our loft, stating he was told this would psychologically terrorize me before their ultimate plan, which was to abduct me and murder me in a ritual sacrifice. And he spilled the beans about being in the car with Zion when he T-boned Bruce's car, and then assisted in dragging our near-dead bodies to the shed in the woods with plans to finish us off during their rituals. Not only that, he confessed to a bunch of other crimes that had nothing to do with me, including the kidnapping and slaying of someone else that used to be part of their sick cult. Turns out that was who they used for the sacrifice the week I first decided not to come. Every single one of them went to jail for being accessories to his murder. Most of them with disfigurements from the torching I'd given them. That includes, of course, Sophia, my nutcase of an ex, who it was confirmed had received her injuries from Zion. When I hadn't shown up, he mercilessly beat her to the point of near coma in front of everyone while promising it would be the fate of anyone else who double-crossed them. To prove his point further, he then brought out that poor son of a bitch they would all go down for murdering, and they drained him right then and there. The details of all of this were gruesome to say the least, and they were outlined in days' worth of local papers out here. However, in the end, they'd just become a footnote in what is now known as the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. Thankfully, the boy from Elnora had nothing to do with any of it. He was taken by his uncle and returned home before the end of the year. Another story that sold papers out here like hotcakes in Indiana. As for me, well, I was off the hook, and the policeman who threatened to throw the book at me sent me an official apology. My lawyer said they were scared of a lawsuit, but I wasn't about to sue anybody anyway. I was just glad to start putting everything behind me once and for all, though this scar on my palm is now and will always be a constant reminder. I was sure sorry to have gotten Bruce into such a horrid situation, but I think I redeemed myself at the last second. He's never held anything against me. And speaking of redemption, today, in our late 50s now, we work together at the same animal rescue foundation we had rolled in all those years ago. I can never bring back any of those poor animals I had a hand in bringing to a painful early demise, but I've done all I can since to save as many as I possibly can from meeting similar fates. It's the best I can do, and ultimately, the best one can do is never anything to be ashamed of. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of another broadcast. I hope you've enjoyed your trip through Nocturnity as much as I did being your guide. That really was a harrowing tale. If you liked it, you can prove it by giving it a like, and if you'd be so kind, a share as well, and help us reach even more listeners. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. It'll take all of 2 seconds, and it'll be the best decision you've made all day. As always, this story has been brought to you by CardanApparel.com. Shopping with Cardan Apparel will not only have you looking great, but you'll be supporting the continuation of this channel in the process. It's a double win. The link's in the description. And just a reminder for all of our listeners, it is now officially our October Terror Fest, and as such, all of our broadcasts for the rest of the month will not only be terrifying, but they will also center around the year's most evil day, All Hallows Eve. Next episode will feature an epic story of one person's foolish decision to delve into the dark arts in a famous graveyard through that notoriously tempting yet demonic tool, a Ouija board, and together we'll witness the hell that is unleashed as a result. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one. Until then, my friends, stay safe.